it all for me.
Thank you. Excited to be here. I told them that I would come and talk to a few people about some of the things that we worked with at Airbnb, and there's hundreds of people here. So happy to see that you guys are interested. I hope you find this useful. The way that I thought about this talk, I called it building a unicorn. It's about Airbnb, but the point is really about kind of what happened behind the scenes at Airbnb that made it a successful company. And I think with that framework, it's really for the entrepreneurs in the audience who are engaged in their own sort of pursuits of building a company and the types of problems and challenges that you'll face, which I think were very similar to the challenges that we faced at Airbnb. And hopefully this inspires you to think of new ways to kind of break past them. So what's ahead? So the way that I put this together is I want to show you guys what we did with data at Airbnb, how that influenced our strategy, and how that affected the way that we organize ourselves. Because I think the Airbnb story, as people have heard it, is very sort of first order. It's very surface level. You see the products that we launch. You kind of see the marketing campaigns that we put out. You hear about our growth, and you go and stay in an Airbnb, meet a host, which is all great. But there was a lot that was happening behind the scenes that made all of that stuff possible. And that's a story that I think doesn't typically get told. So let's dive into that. First, I want to kind of give you guys some context. There are two sort of kernels of wisdom that were hugely important to Airbnb. And this is kind of old news. I'm sure many of you guys are familiar with this. But you're going to see this play out throughout the rest of the talk. The first one comes from Paul Graham when Brian, Nate, and Joe did Y Combinator. And he talked about, it's better to have 100 people love you than 1 million people like you. And that it's better to kind of engage with the people who use your product than, kind of build something at scale that doesn't necessarily connect with people. It's all about connections with people. And similarly, within the culture of the company, or inside the company, the culture is really, really important. And they had this moment when they went to Las Vegas, and they met with Tony Hsieh, the founder of Zappos, who wrote this book about happiness and culture. And they were really taken with this idea that they didn't have to build sort of a company with sort of the stale feeling of corporations, that our parents had joined. They could do something different. It could be more of a human place to work. And working with each other and enjoying working with each other is really fundamental to building a great company. So those two ideas, connecting, it was really about people. It was about connecting with the people who are going to use what you're making and about the people that you work with. And those two things were super important for us at Airbnb. So diving into the story a little bit, Ramen Profitable was a concept that the founders kind of drew on a mirror in the early days. They wanted to get to a point where they could afford ramen, which is the cheapest food you can possibly find in San Francisco. But they wanted to get to a point where Airbnb had some traction, and they were trying to figure out how to do that. And so Paul Graham, of course, told them to go and talk to people, and they were doing that. And they were building a product kind of in response to what people said that they needed. But they brought me on in 2010, like Fanny mentioned, at a time when companies weren't hiring data. In fact, the term data science didn't even exist yet. It wasn't coined until a couple years later. And so we met through mutual friends, and they said, we have a little bit of data. We have some people who are using this thing that we're building, and we want to understand it. We want to better understand how to serve these people and how to kind of make this platform better. So how do we do that? And so I joined and kind of started thinking about things and started to create what we called sort of the data engine, right? We began by, of course, thinking, I don't know how technical you guys want me to get here, but we started thinking about the concept of logging. How do you capture what people are thinking and feeling and doing in a way that can be useful for, your understanding of those things? We thought about kind of the design of our warehouse, the way that information is stored. We thought about our infrastructure, the way that you can work with your data. And it was all very simplistic back then, and it evolved massively over the years afterwards, but we kind of created sort of the core basic infrastructure to understand the community. And we didn't have enough data to really get into higher level statistical stuff, but we could start to pick out these sort of aggregate trends. And that was really important for us, right? We were able to start to think about the way we prioritize our time, our resources, which in a startup, when you're very resource constrained, is critical. Every decision you make is super important, and it determines kind of the life or death of the company. And so we wanted to be very strategic about our data. So we started to look at trends in aggregate, And we saw people moving from city to city, of course, and that some cities actually influenced regions. If we won Paris, we would get Marseille. If we got Marseille, we would get Nice. If we got Nice, you get these smaller and smaller areas. There was a lot of kind of virality associated with the product. Somebody would like New York was like the gateway drug for Airbnb. Everybody came to New York first, and then they would go home and they would become a host, which was really interesting. And then once they were hosts, someone else would come and stay with them, and they would go home and be a host. So the trick was like, how do we move from one city to another in a way that's strategic? What are the most important nodes that exist within our platform that we should be especially focused on? And so we started these marketing campaigns, which, and again, there were like only a couple of us at the time. It was like 10 people working in this small apartment, their apartment, Brian and Joe's apartment. I worked in their bedroom, which is a little weird. But we were trying to drive growth in like Rome, and it's like for like 2 people in Brian's bedroom, how do we grow Airbnb in Rome? And so we kind of looked at these aggregate trends in our data, and we would say like, there's all these people who are searching for Rome, and there's like nobody who's hosting. And so at the time, Facebook ads were just getting started. And we were able to target people in Rome with those ads. And we'd say, become a host. And we'd try all these different versions of the ad until we saw that it started to work. And so we would get more and more people to host. And then eventually we got so many people who signed up to be hosts that it outweighed demand. And so then we would go to Google and look for people who are searching for a trip to take in Rome. And we'd say, hey, if you're going to Rome, why don't you use Airbnb? And that's how we drove supply and demand and started to balance out these markets. But what was also happening behind the scene, I love this picture, by the way. This is one night after work. We all went to this trampoline warehouse. I'm not in it because I broke my ankle 2 minutes before on one of these damn blue things. But anyways, it was super fun. And like we had this group of people that we had very carefully picked to work with each other. Everybody who joined Airbnb was interviewed by everybody else at Airbnb. It had to be like a unanimous decision that this is somebody we all want to work with, which of course made hiring like impossible. And we had to interview people incessantly. But the group of people that we wound up with were all people that you could sit next to for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you didn't hate it. It was actually a lot of fun. And because we all got along so well, there was a lot of trust that was created between people. And everyone was able to kind of communicate, work with each other, and had perfect context into what everyone else was doing. So when Joe, whose cell phone was customer support, people would call Joe and say, I've got this problem. Joe would then say, okay, I'm sorry, we'll fix it. And he'd turn to Nick, the engineer, and he'd say, look, people are having trouble with this thing, and Nick would fix it. And then he would turn to Nate and say, okay, we can turn back on growth in Rome because we fixed this thing. And so everybody had perfect context into what was happening, and we were able to move very, very quickly. Which was, of course, super important and something that I'll talk about later as we started to get a lot bigger. That becomes very tricky. So things in Airbnb were going well. This is late 2010, early 2011. We feel like things are starting to work. We feel good about where things are going. And it was not long thereafter that a very important moment happened in Airbnb history. I'm sure you guys recognize these guys, the Samware brothers. They're famous for cloning successful startups in Silicon Valley and building them out very quickly in Europe, which is a terrifying thing if it happens to you in San Francisco, because you're faced with this decision where you either lose Europe to the Samwares or you go off and you have to buy them, right? At a time when you don't have the resources to do that sort of thing. Or you have to fight and just kind of duke it out with these guys. But they're very experienced, they're very successful at what they do. And so in 2011, when we found out that they had cloned Airbnb and started to build out Wimdu, that was a real sort of gut check for us. And I think it really shocked Airbnb into adulthood. I think previously, I would characterize the company as like a teenager. And this is like a moment where it's like, we have to be an adult now. We have to really grow up in the way that we do everything, and we have to do it faster. So what did we do? First, again, we began with our data. And I think at this point, we had, we're much bigger. The company was bigger. We had more data. We were able to go much deeper with the data that we had and start to understand the users behind Airbnb and use actual statistics to understand what do people like, what do people not like, what do they prefer. And what's interesting about this relative to what we were doing before is that previously we could just see kind of the markets where Airbnb needed to be, but we couldn't really see the people because we didn't have enough data to really understand what people were doing. And the Samwares were able to see Airbnb's markets and its growth and its traction, and they were able to build sort of a business that was very similar to us. but they didn't have access to our data and they couldn't see the people behind the product. So as we studied them, we found some things that were really interesting. 68% of people would visit, of people who were trying to book as a guest, would visit a host profile before booking. They wanted to see who's this person that they're staying with. First-time guests were 20% more likely to visit a host profile than people who had done it before. If someone had a bad experience, their likelihood of coming back dropped 26%. But if we had a customer support team that worked with those people and kind of addressed the experience, that reduced to 6%. And 75% of trips were reviewed, and hosts without reviews were 4 times less likely to get booked than hosts who had reviews. So these are some examples of statistics that we're able to kind of uncover from our data that helped us think about the approach that we would take to the SAMRs, which was to focus on trust. It was to focus on people, build better connections with the community. Again, getting back to that point I mentioned earlier from Paul Graham, and focus on the people on the platform rather than growth. So that's what we did. Now, we did a bunch of things to kind of help our host community, including building a big customer support team, but we also built a photography operation where we'd go from property to property, or we'd send photographers to properties, take pictures of the property for the host for free and upload them for the host to give people a better sense for like, what is this thing that they're booking? We made it mandatory that everybody upload a picture of themselves and write a description about themselves so their profiles were a little bit more trustworthy. We did a bunch of experiments and tests on how to get people to leave reviews with more information, higher quality information. So these are just like a couple examples of things that we started to work on. But in aggregate, they had this effect of creating more trust within the community of Airbnb, and therefore more retention and people kind of staying on the platform, which is ultimately what helped us win. But simultaneously, we went out into the world and we started to build offices. We started to build a presence in, I love this picture, by the way. We started to build a presence in markets around the world. Before Airbnb, or before the sort of SAMWares came along, we had 15 people at that point working in a little warehouse in San Francisco. But after the SAMWares came, we realized that we needed a presence all over the world to be closer to the people who are using Airbnb. So we acquired a company named Ecolio in Hamburg, and then eventually we built a team in Berlin, and then we started to build teams here in Paris and around Europe and in Asia and in Latin America, and established this kind of global footprint for what we were doing so we could be that much closer to the people that were using Airbnb and understand them that much better. For me and for the other people in San Francisco, that meant we were spending a lot of time flying around and trying to share insights about like how we understood the business, how we understood the community, how we understood our data, and kind of get everyone on the same page, which was challenging because the team was so small. And so later on, we realized we had to kind of build more tools and infrastructure to kind of help share insights and things. But we started to think about the problem of not just connecting with the community of people using Airbnb, but also the employees who are working for Airbnb and how to like get everyone on the same page, which I'll talk more about in a moment. But ultimately, it was an intense couple years, and they were successful. I think by focusing on the community, by focusing on trust, and by understanding our data, it made a huge difference in kind of the way Airbnb grew relative to Wimdu. And ultimately, we beat them. And not long thereafter, we started to shift our focus from internationalization back to the product, to the thing that we're all there to build that we're so excited about. And we had been a little bit distracted until then by growth and the SAMWares and these sorts of things. And so we wanted to get back to kind of the core of our like infrastructure and technology that would help Airbnb work better for the people behind it. On the data side, we started to think a lot more about personalization and matching. And this comes from kind of a funny moment. It was late one night. One of the guys on our team was like, there's this interesting thing. He was like, do you know what happens when someone searches for San Francisco? And I was like, well, they get a bunch of properties in San Francisco. And he's like, yeah, but like, where are those properties? And he's like, what happens is you put San Francisco into our search bar, and we take that string and we send it to Google, and Google sends back a latitude and longitude coordinate for where it thinks that place is, and then we return lots of listings around that place. How many of you guys have been to San Francisco? Okay, a bunch of you. How many of you know where that is, the pink thing? No one? One? Alex, you know it, my wife. No, that's the Tenderloin. That's the worst part of San Francisco. It's awful. Like, if you go to San Francisco, don't go to the Tenderloin. It's terrible. And that's where we were sending everybody. Because we sort of naively just, took this latitude, longitude coordinate from Google and returned stuff around it. But this is an example of the technology doing what you told it to do, but it doesn't understand how to do it right. And so we had to start to teach the machines behind Airbnb what it means to be right. So we started to think about personalization and matching, and we took people's review scores, we kind of mapped them out around San Francisco, and we were able to show that people leave higher reviews, better reviews, when they stay in neighborhoods that are nice, right? Makes sense? It's not groundbreaking stuff here. But the point was the machines didn't know this, and we didn't know that the machines didn't know that. And so we started to build these algorithms that would help train the machines about what constitutes good for anywhere in the world that anybody ever searches, because every city has its own footprint. This is the quality of reviews relative to distance from the center point of the city. And you can see that San Francisco, New York, LA, they're all different. And so you can't create some sort of handmade model to tell machines how every place should be represented in Airbnb's results. We had to use the data that we had about people's experience to train it to work more effectively. And so this was one example of many things that we were doing like this. But it was very successful in improving our search results and people's experiences behind Airbnb, which was great. But it was around this time that Brian, the CEO, read the book, a book of Walt Disney, kind of talking about his life and his experiences building Disney, and was very fascinated by the story of Snow White. When he made Snow White, his first feature-length animation, he sat down first and storyboarded the process. He went through kind of each of the most important moments or milestones of what he wanted Snow White to be, and drew them out, so he made sure they didn't miss them. And then they would kind of stitch those moments together in kind of the rest of the work that they were doing with the film, but it ensured that nothing was missed. And so Brian was like, why haven't we done this for Airbnb? What does it mean to be a guest and a host? What are the critical moments for guests and hosts? And are we accomplishing what we need to at each of those? The answer is no, right? We were very focused on the online experience that people had, coming to Airbnb and searching and booking, but then we kind of let it go after that. The whole offline experience was offline and untouchable for us. But when you use Airbnb, that's all you remember. You don't remember the whole process of searching and booking. You remember, going to Paris and staying with a Parisian and going to the cafes and all these sorts of things. And so that was a really important moment for us to recognize that we weren't an online business, we were an offline business. And our whole focus on the online experience was not what mattered. What mattered was the offline experience, and we needed to find a way to kind of involve ourselves there. And so we started to design teams around these key moments and start thinking about the offline experience, which you guys may have seen a few months ago was launched in the whole experiences product of Airbnb. That's the culmination of this sort of moment for Brian. It's something we worked on for several years, and it's going to be a huge part of Airbnb in the future. But what we realized in going through this process is that what we had done in the previous years at Airbnb in thinking about how to use our data to drive markets and then understand people and then build products in response to the needs of those people was a concept that we could then extend out to all the other milestones of the business. And so we wanted to build teams that were focused on each milestone, and that required building an organization. So we had more and more people joining. And from the perspective of my team, grew from just a couple of us to over 100 people pretty quickly. And there are a lot of really important questions that we grappled with along the way. And this is sort of a high-class problem. Once you have hundreds and hundreds of people in the company, it's not where most startups wind up. But if you do, it's actually a real problem because when you were early, working in Roush, all sitting around the table, all sort of on the same page and talking to each other, it's super easy. But when you have hundreds of people, it's how do you coordinate them? And from the perspective of a data science organization, it brings up lots of interesting questions about how to organize yourselves. Should it be one centralized group where everybody sits and works together? Or should it be distributed out where everybody sits with people who do different things? And should they be focused as one group that creates knowledge, right, one department, or should they be focused on topics? ultimately, we wound up with sort of these cross-functional units. It was like a matrix organization where we had sort of engineers and designers and data scientists all sitting together and all working together, which we found to work much better than having people sitting within their own large teams. Even if they were sitting like 5 feet away from, like if I'm a data scientist and I'm sitting next to an engineer, I thought this was fascinating. I had like a whole table of my data scientists. We all sat together, and behind us was a whole table of engineers. And nobody trusted anybody. The engineers didn't trust the data scientists didn't trust the engineers, and there was all this bickering and bullshit. And finally one day I was like, listen, we have to like break up our little table here. I was like, we can't sit together anymore. And the data scientists were really upset about this, and everybody was very sad, and it was a dark moment in our history and all this. But we said, listen, you guys are both working on the concept of matching, engineers and data scientists, regardless of your discipline and your schooling and all these sorts of things. You're working on the same problem. Why don't you sit together and think about it? And like overnight, all of the trust issues just disappeared. Like everything just worked. And people would stay late and they were talking about stuff, and there were all these serendipitous ideas that were amazing. And everything started to work. So it was like this kind of funny moment for me where it was like, God, just like sitting someone next to someone else, it makes such a difference. We also implemented something that they used at Facebook, which I thought was really great. Each of these teams started to think about the way that they worked, the way that they sort of delivered on their goals. And Facebook had this model called UIE, Understand, Identify, Execute, where basically they would begin any sort of project with this understand phase where they'd go off and do a bunch of research and dig through the data and try to understand the sort of context of the problem. And then once they'd fully understood it, they would identify the lever that was most useful, they thought, in kind of affecting whatever change they needed to. And then they would run a bunch of experiments and figure out whether this hypothesis that they had was as effective as they hoped it would be. And then they would circle back to the beginning and carry on. So we adopted this model for these cross-functional teams, and it was really good. But then over time, we started to get really big. Thousands of people. Crazy. Go into these team meetings for my team, and it would look like this. And I was like, who are you people? Jesus. But it was great. I mean, they were wonderful people. They were super talented. But there's this huge communication cost now. And if you can make everyone sort of 1% more productive, it has this massive aggregate effect on the whole company. And the cost of communication across 1,000 people is really significant. So it drags down productivity. So we started to think about how do you balance those two things? How can you increase how effective everyone else is at work? How do you create leverage? And so this is where we started to pivot the concept of our data from understanding just the community to actually understanding how people work and where are their pain points and how can we help them be better at what they do. And we found a couple things that were sort of funny. One was that Airbnb had tons of seasonality, right? People prefer to travel to different locations at different times of year, obviously. But we found that there was as much seasonality to our analysis as there was to the business. People were answering the same questions at the same months of every year. And it was always too hard to go back and figure out what you had done before, and so you're like, screw it, I'll just do it again, which is hugely inefficient. Our infrastructure was breaking all the time because so many people were using it. We had so much data, and it was taking everyone forever to kind of get an answer to a simple question. And this is one of my favorite queries. This goes on for a couple hundred more lines. This is how to calculate revenue. It was crazy. It was the hardest thing in the world. And so we're like, surely there's a better way, right? So we started to build tools, we started to build infrastructure, and we open sourced all of it, which was great because it gave our engineers and data scientists a little credibility in the technical community for what they built, and it returned some solutions to problems that we had solved at Airbnb to other startups. So if you guys are founders, working in different startups, I highly recommend you check out the Knowledge Repo, AirPal, and Airflow. Those are 3 tools that are amazing, and they completely changed our lives at Airbnb. But around the same time, we started to have this question of at a higher level, what are we doing? What are all these thousands of people at Airbnb meant to be doing? And we had a sense for how the business worked after the whole Snow White exercise, but we needed a stronger North Star that everyone could map their work to. It was very hard. People understood when they were successful, in their own little sort of arena, working on a payment mechanism or customer support channels or something. But it was where's this all getting to? And I remember sitting with our CFO, and we're asking the same question. We're how do we make sense of all this work and actually prioritize our time across all these different tracks. Like if I hire another data scientist, where's the most important place in the company for them to go? That was a really hard question for us to answer. And so there's this talk by Simon Sinek, which I think is great. I'm sure many of you have seen it. But it's like, being clear about your mission, like why do you exist, right? And then once you understand why, it's like, how do you deliver on this mission that you've established? And then what do you do in service of that? And so we went through this exercise at Airbnb and came up with this, very sort of concise definition of why Airbnb exists. We want people to be able to belong anywhere, which is a great term. And so then we said, well, how do we measure that? And we said, well, like a pretty easy proxy is like, nights where people are staying on, where guests are staying with hosts, right? Like that's sort of a concept of belonging, or at least it shows when people are like having these experiences. And so we said, okay, well, what do we predict is going to happen this year in terms of how much of this is going to happen, and then where do we actually want to get to above and beyond that? And then how do we map everyone's work into sort of that North Star? And so it started to create more of a framework for everyone to interpret their work through, and helped us make decisions about how to prioritize sort of one track of work over another. Which it's funny, like in retrospect, I'm like, why didn't we do that in like 2010? We totally could have done that, and it would have been great. And then around the same time, we said, okay, so now we've got like this, this sense for where we're headed and why we're going and what's meaningful. But how do we sort of organize ourselves, relative to that North Star? And we realized, it was kind of a funny analogy, that like, it was similar to like, 10-year-olds who play soccer or football, right? They like kick the ball and everybody goes running after the ball. And the ball goes over here and everybody goes running after the ball. And it's like crazy, right? But when you look at great teams, like your European teams, people hold their position. They know where they work, they know where they belong, they know their position, they stay there, they work as an integrated unit. And that was something that we needed to be a lot more mindful about at Airbnb. And we designed those positions around the frames in Snow White, those key milestones for guests and hosts. And then we could map all those positions up to this sort of aggregate outcome and understand, together what we were working toward. So that takes us to sort of this time last year. And it's amazing, like, startup time. It's like, I'd been there for 6.5 years, and, it felt both like, 10 minutes and 20 years. Like, it was kind of conflicting, like, which is it? But it was crazy. And I finally kind of took a step back, and I said, all of this has been amazing. This has been an incredible experience. But what's sort of the next thing for me? And I was sort of plagued with this question of, like, how do you kind of continue to create impact in the world, even beyond Airbnb? I was very proud of where we'd come from. I think that, like, we had connected millions of people around the world in ways that, help people understand each other's cultures. We'd reduced, the footprint of globalization in a way that I think makes it more environmentally sustainable. We'd given people opportunities to create new streams of income that many people use to kind of support artistic passions and pursuits and these sorts of things. So there's a lot of good that I think came out of Airbnb. But I was trying to figure out sort of what's next, right? And eventually, my wife and I decided to leave Airbnb in San Francisco. And we said, where's somewhere that we can go and kind of, think about life? And she wanted to get into wine, and this is a great place to get into wine. She's studying wine here. And I wanted to take some time and kind of figure out, like, what is this next thing for me? How do you create this kind of impact going forward? And then, of course, in the fall, Trump was elected, which was like a real wake-up call. It's like, Jesus, what happened? It was amazing for me. It was like a real shock. And we can debate for hours about, like, what led to that. But I don't think that's what's important. I think that what's important is, where do we go from here? Tech and globalization may or may not be responsible for Trump's rise. But I think what it is responsible for is creating a solution to the future, to making globalization sustainable. I think what we've seen is that globalization is absolutely imperfect. There are a lot of problems that have come with it. But I also think it's inevitable. And, like, trying to fight globalization or be against it is like fighting with the wind, right? Like, you can build a wall against it, but all that does is box you in. And so the question is, how do you sort of move the wind in a direction that makes more sense, that's better for us? And I think, for me, the wind is really the exchange of, like, culture and ideas and a lot of the concepts that are, like, inherent to globalization. And I think that is why I'm here in Paris, why I'm talking to you guys tonight. I want to share the ideas, my experiences, hopefully you're able to do something with them. Because I think that entrepreneurs are really going to be the agents of change going forward. A lot of the problems that we have around the world, climate change, et cetera, are problems that are international. They're cross-border in nation. They're naturally cross-border. And so it's entrepreneurs who are thinking in a global context that I think can actually solve some of these problems that are inherently global in nature. And so I want to kind of figure out how we can do that. And I don't just think that entrepreneurialism is restricted to the business world. You know, like the whole mentality of Silicon Valley has been brought to bear on the Golden State Warriors. They didn't win last year, but they're really good, and they're probably going to win this year. And you know, the American Civil Liberties Union just joined Y Combinator. They're going to be in a batch this winter. So there's a lot of these concepts that are really powerful for all kinds of things that we can do. And so I want to leave you guys with like a couple thoughts about, you know, sort of distilling some of the most important insights to me that came out of the Airbnb experience. And the first is this idea of creating the outcomes that you want through an architecture of your organization, however it works. Like this visualization of, you know, what guests and hosts actually experience as they use Airbnb is like the skeleton of Airbnb, right? And it wasn't until we really understood this that we were able to kind of like affect change more successfully. And so I recommend that whatever you guys do, you know, go through the process of storyboarding it. Understand really how it works. Like, what are the most important things, most important experiences associated with whatever you're doing? And how do you measure those things? What data do you have at each of these points that tells you whether they're going well or not? Those are the metrics that you set. Are you doing things that are actually making a difference? Or are you just moving one thing up which moves the next thing down? You have to have good sort of quality metrics for understanding this stuff. Are you using the concepts of experimentation to understand causally what happened relative to what you did? And do you understand the people behind the numbers? Do you understand who they are and why they're doing these things and what motivates them? Or are you treating them like one aggregate group where everyone is the same, which obviously doesn't make any sense. And so that leads me to like, what is data science? It's a term that doesn't mean anything, right? What is the science of data? What science doesn't use data? To me, data science is about feedback loops. In the early days, as I mentioned, Paul Graham was very influential to Airbnb, and as a result of his advice, Brian and Joe would fly to New York every weekend, and they would meet with guests and hosts and talk to them. They would say, you know, why are you using Airbnb? What's working? What's not working? And that set the direction for what they did with the product. But a couple years later, and I think that's actually a big reason why Airbnb was so successful, is we had this culture of listening, right? But fast forward a couple years, and there's millions of people using Airbnb. And how do you talk to all of them? And then there's thousands of employees. How do they talk to all of them? There's like this many-to-many problem that's impossible without data. And like, what is data, right? Like data is, it's a reflection of like a decision. It's a reflection of an emotion. It's a reflection of like a trait or characteristic of someone. And so in aggregate, you can understand kind of the people behind the numbers. Really, to me, data science is hearing the voice of your community. It's being able to connect with them at scale. And the more you pay attention, I think the better you'll be at providing whatever service it is that you're working on. But it's not easy, right? It's something that you have to work at. It's something that you have to build a large organization around, infrastructure, tools. It's very complicated. But this is the last point, is culture. Culture to me is like the most important part of what made Airbnb successful. I think the way that we leveraged our data was one important piece of it, but the other piece was the way that we work together. For me, culture is kind of the oil for the machine. And I think it's largely something that's felt rather than spoken. You can create sort of, like a set of values that you guys, sort of hope to adhere to, which is good, but really it shows up in your actions. One thing that I found that was kind of funny is that like the personality of the leader of a team, for better or worse, is a mirror image of the culture of its team, or sort of the other way around. So like, as teams got bigger at Airbnb, you'd see like they all had their own culture, and it was largely a reflection of their leader. So if you lead a large team, the way you show up every day will be the way that people treat each other. There are these incredible ripple effects that happen within the team, and it's something you have to be very mindful of. I realized that firing is just as important as hiring. If you have people who are dragging down the culture, who are really negative to each other, that's worse than hiring someone who's just like mediocre. You have to, the culture of a team is something that you have to like really work at and maintain and hold in high regard. And the diversity of your team is probably the most important thing. If you have a bunch of people who all look and sound and think like each other, you're not going to be innovative. You have to bring different people from different backgrounds together. And so what I saw at Airbnb was that like whenever we had technology problems, they were always rooted in people problems. It was always because somebody chose not to talk to somebody else. It wasn't because somebody was stupid. And so really the culture of the team was what helped us build a lasting and great organization. So good luck to all of you with whatever you do. I hope it's great. I hope it's impactful. You just had to reach me if you guys want to chat. And I think now we're going to do some questions.
So one of the things that millennials value is freedom and mobility.
Mm-hmm.
And Airbnb is allowing millennials to do that.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is missing in the travel industry? Where do you think it's going to go next? Or has Airbnb exploited that?
I think one of the really interesting and challenging directions for the company is the offline setting. Online is the stuff that's easy. It's the offline that's really hard. Knowing what people want to do and kind of how to provide services around those things when there isn't data that's naturally sort of available for where people want to go. So for example, when people, I think people can search for flights pretty easily, although there's obviously lots of room to improve upon the way you measure like the quality of experiences within sort of like the travel domain. And I think there's lots of data that of course exists, from Airbnb and hotels and others around like lodging. But where people go and what they do when they get there is, I think, something that, has a lot of room to grow. One of the ideas that came out of a hackathon years ago that I thought was really interesting is this question of like a recommendation engine for where to go next, right? Kind of like, Amazon will tell you like people who bought this book, also bought this book, which is great. And you can do that. You can say like, guess what? People who went to New York also went to Paris, which is like not super useful. But I think what is interesting is that like neighborhoods have very distinct personalities, and they're very different from each other. But you often see similar neighborhoods showing up in every city around the world. So like if you liked staying in the Mission in San Francisco, odds are you like Brooklyn. Odds are you like Kreuzberg. Odds are you like Shoreditch. So that was kind of a fun idea that came out of one of these hackathons, is like, what are the sister neighborhoods around the world that if you like one, you could then travel to another? Maybe Airbnb does something with that, or maybe not. But I think the whole concept of personalization and matching in offline settings has a long way to go.
Thanks for your speech. So you told about data analysis, but what stage is a startup large enough to start something like this? Because I think Airbnb was already big when you came in 2010. So how did you manage to know it was good time?
Well, I think when I joined, it was actually still a lot earlier than when other companies were starting to hire data people. Again, it's before the term data science was coined, and there's all this excitement about it. I think now it's pretty common to bring data scientists in super early. Although, of course, like when you're just starting a company, it may not make sense to hire a bunch of data scientists because there's no data for them to analyze. But there is a lot of work required in designing kind of the systems that will house your data and the way the organization will consume data. So almost as soon as you have like a V0 of your product, you kind of have to have that stuff mapped out and figured out so that like as data starts to come in, you can understand it. There was a really nice relationship that we had with another team in Airbnb that was a group of sociologists and psychologists, sort of user researchers, who would get together with people and talk to them in offline settings, right? Like they would speak with them and they would design surveys and they would do like a lot of the things that were meant to kind of understand in very specific contexts, what was happening. Sort of similar to Brian and Joe going to New York and meeting with guests and hosts. And there were, of course, lots of debates between the data scientists and them about how to do this stuff right. And the data scientists were like, you guys are too easily biased by, information that's maybe not meaningful at scale. And they're like, well, you guys just look at data and you don't understand, the people behind it. And, so of course there's always bickering about these ideas, but I think that, when it works well and when startups are very young, I think you can have data scientists that are looking at the bigger picture kind of in aggregate and distilling, what are the most important kind of tracks of work or, channels that we should go down. And then when they get stuck, they can't go any further with the data. They should either do this themselves or work with, experts in this type of work to understand, how much further they could go with data. What are the other things that they should be logging and capturing and designing sort of a platform around so that data is then returned and gives you a more complete picture of what's happening. And I think like starting a relationship like that, a culture like that, very early on in a startup is really important.
Hi, my name is Reda. I'm the co-founder and CTO of a travel company.
Cool.
Thank you for your pitch. It was great to hear about data and Airbnb.
Thanks.
I had two questions. The first one is about your culture of logging. How far do you go in the logging of the behavior of your users? And what's the second question is after your answer, and what's the weight of the behavior versus the action?
It's really interesting. I think the question of like, sort of emotional data is super interesting. Like how do you figure out not just that somebody went from page A to page B, but did they like it or did they hate it, right? And there's lots of proxy data that people use, like time on page and whatever. And of course, there's surveys that get sent out and that sort of thing, NPS scores, which are okay, but they're not great. We used quality drag metrics, to understand. Well, there were some things like retention, which is obvious. Like, do people come back after the experience? There's reviews, which are great because they tell you directly what they thought of the experience. We did use Net Promoter Score and look at time on page, and we did all those things. But I think we still had a long way to go at Airbnb, and I don't think that's like a problem that we totally cracked. Like I think Brian used to always kind of nag me with this question about like, how do we measure love, and how do we know that a 5-star review is actually a 5-star review and not just like a 4-star review kind of biased upwards? Like how do you tell the difference between those things? What does it mean for something to be great? And it's super hard. Like I don't think that we totally figured that out yet, but I think it's something that people spend a lot of time thinking about. And even if you can't measure it perfectly, I think what you can do is design lots of proximate metrics around the concept and run experiments to see what effect anything you do kind of has on the way people interact with the product that you build. And I think that's going to be the only way that we sort of iterate to some sort of solution of how to solve a problem like that. So it's sort of an incomplete answer because honestly, like I don't know, it's super hard. But we definitely wanted to get there, and I know that there are lots and lots of people at Airbnb who are thinking about that.
Hello, thank you for your speech. I'm Aitam, I'm a software engineer in a financial bank. So my question is, when Airbnb started to grow and to go outside the United States, what was the first strategy of growing? Did you choose one country to focus on and you go yourselves to meet people, or do you recruit some people in this country to talk with the potential future customers? How did you do that?
Yeah, so I mean, we had the benefit of a global business to start, right? It was from the beginning in international business. We had people in some of the largest kind of cities around the world that started to use Airbnb pretty early. So rather than doing a bunch of kind of back of the envelope math about like where would be most strategic for us to go, we kind of let the community tell us. My background is in economics, and I love thinking about the way that markets function, right? How does supply and demand work? And so like one of the earliest frameworks that we built at Airbnb was understanding the balance of supply and demand and using that as a signal for where we needed to grow more. So again, if like lots and lots and lots of people were searching for places to stay in Paris and there were no hosts, then we had to go to Paris, right? And then once you kind of balance that out, then people want to go somewhere else, and you kind of follow them there and try to make the experience as good as possible there. So we were fortunate in the fact that we didn't have to spend a lot of time thinking about what we wanted to do with the business. We kind of let the community tell us.
How did you deal with privacy issues? I mean, legally and ethically.
Yeah. So yeah, privacy in the context of data science is like a really important question and really important problem. I think that, well, let me just kind of give you the philosophy that we landed on at Airbnb that I think was most effective. I think that when you're logging data surreptitiously that people don't know that you're logging, that's very bad. I don't think you should do that. I don't think it's ethical to do that. And I think you should be very transparent and upfront about what you're logging and how you're logging it and what purpose it's meant to serve. There was a period, years ago when we had what we called like a holy grail problem. It was like, something that nobody could figure out, but we felt like if we did, it was like the key to everything, right? And it was like, how much do hosts want to be booked? It's like so simple, but there are all these different ways that we're trying to get at, like, what do hosts want, and like, how do we sort of better deliver on that? And finally, someone had the brilliant idea to just ask them. It was like, how much do you want to be booked? And if people don't really want to respond to surveys so much, and they hate being sort of nagged and pestered and things. But what we realized is when you pair that with a service that you offer in response to that data, then people are both more open to responding and more comfortable with the fact that you're logging their response. So we thought about this pricing algorithm that we built, which was like, you tell us how much you want to be booked, and then we'll tell you what price is set. It's like a quid pro quo. And I think that was really, really effective. And sort of that mentality of data products then started to expand out to many other places where we were trying to capture data.
Hi, I'm CTO for a travel company.
Hello.
That's trying very hard to make globalization sustainable. So you mentioned that you were starting to think about that very seriously. So I would like to know what ideas you have right now, if you have something that you can share.
I'm sorry to say I don't have many ideas yet. I think it's something that I'm figuring out. I have a good friend of mine, David, here, who he and his wife Jenny moved out here a week ago, and we're spending a lot of time trying to understand that. We don't have an answer yet, but if we do, you'll be the first to know.
Hello, thank you for the speech. Have you ever made a mistake with data analysis, and how can you deal with mistake? What are you doing when you find you made a mistake?
We never made a mistake, so. No, we made millions of mistakes. I mean, those were the most important moments for us. That's when we learned. Mistakes aren't bad. I think there's like two types of mistakes. I think there's the type that's avoidable. Like you're doing something the wrong way that you could have done the right way if you just kind of talked to other people who had done that. And those are super frustrating because those are like distractions that, slow down a startup that needs to otherwise be moving really quickly. But there's another type of mistake, which is like, you had a hypothesis that just turned out not to be true. And we had tons of those. In fact, we encouraged those. It was like, think of the craziest thing you possibly can and let's try it. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But if you're too sort of narrow-minded in what you're doing and always just kind of trying to be right, like you just iterate your way to like a local maximum. Like it's the mistakes that shock you into a global maximum, and I think those are super important. And you can only really get there if you have a robust process for testing hypotheses and understanding causally what moves things. So I'd encourage lots of those mistakes.
Thanks for the talk. I want to get your feedback and perspective as an early startup employee at Airbnb. Because the first thing they say is you build a prototype, go talk to your customers. When you do that, how do you avoid the false negatives? Because most people don't see past the crude prototype, they don't see the potential. Is there anything that you did as a data scientist to see past that?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I hear your point, right? Because if you're looking at your data or you're talking to people, like it only tells you kind of what you've done in the past. It doesn't necessarily tell you what you can do in the future. But I don't think that's the role that data plays. I think data isn't so much about generating creative hypotheses about what you could and should do next. I think data is about understanding what works and what are the most relevant problems to solve. And I think it's the collaboration between data scientists and engineers and designers and other creative people to hypothesize about, what you can do relative to those problems. Does that make sense? No? You don't get it? Yeah, okay, so what does data do, right? Data tells you, like you've built sort of a V1 of a product, right? And data is streaming in about what people are doing with it. And that tells you roughly what's working, right? Like if there's 100% drop off at a page, that page is broken, right? But it doesn't tell you how to fix the page necessarily, right? What it does is it points you toward the thing that you need to fix. It doesn't tell you how to fix it. It doesn't tell you that like the color's red when it should have been green, for the button, right? But it tells you directionally what's important to solve. There's a good sort of analogy to this in Airbnb history. Again, getting back to the dynamic between us and the sort of qualitative user researchers. We were looking at the rate at which people move past our payments page, cut by their country of origin around the world. And I was like, wow, it's weird. Brazil is way off. Like everyone is doing roughly the same except for Brazil. Like there's something that's not working in Brazil. And we're able to kind of, follow our data down to, kind of one very specific page in the payment process where Brazil was, just far below everyone else. But you can't really go any deeper than that because data doesn't tell you what to fix or what to do about the problem that you have. It tells you where the problem lies, and it tells you that that problem is meaningful. And so we had a couple of these researchers who really took one for the team and went down to Brazil for like 2 weeks and, kind of hanging out in Rio and talking to people. But they sat with people and they're like, as you go through this process, like, what is it about this page that doesn't work for you? And they're like, oh, in Brazil, there's a certain payment instrument that we use online. You guys don't offer it. And they're like, well, there you go. And so they came back and we were like, we adopted that payment instrument. We rolled it out in a controlled experiment, and sure enough, Brazil took off. So that's my point, is that like data doesn't give you the creative solution to the problem that you have necessarily. You still have to go through the process of talking to people and coming up with hypotheses and being creative. But it tells you which problem is meaningful, and it tells you whether the hypothesis that you have about the solution is effective.
Hello, my name is Florent. I'm a CTO at a sports marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're very early stage, and I'm wondering, how did you differentiate the product development between the first market, your first users? I mean, especially as a CTO, I'm very focused on the product, web product,
Mm-hmm.
but we have to take in account our customers' needs, our customers' habits, and how do you draw the line between going on the field and meeting your people, or trying to analyze your data, or trying out some new functionalities on your marketplace?
Yeah. Well, I think it's actually similar to the point I was just making, that like you should use the data that you have to determine, where the biggest opportunity is, right? Sometimes that's within the product itself, looking at conversion rates from one point to another. Other times it's if you're trying to figure out like where to grow, for example, it's looking at where are people using you and where are people not using you, right? And that's usually very indicative. The balance between sort of building the product and looking at your data, I think you always need to do both, but you should build the product in service of the problems that your data tell you are most meaningful, and where kind of growth analytics tells you the opportunities are the biggest. So that's why at Airbnb it was really important for us to have these cross-functional teams where people we're all sitting together. I think when you have just an engineering team on its own, they will work on things that are important, right? They'll build infrastructure and they'll optimize things about the product, but that might not be the best use of their time. And so having a data scientist sitting next to an engineer is actually really valuable, and having a designer sit next to the engineer and data scientist is really valuable. And having people who think about things in different ways all sitting together is very valuable. And I think that's when you will kind of do the most impactful stuff.
As the technology gives you more and more access to more and more data, state of the data, how do you decide which one is meaningful when trying to solve a question, a problem, and which one is not?
So which data is meaningful
Yeah.
relative to a problem? Well, I think so. That's what gets back to this whole kind of like architecture of the business. Is like if you don't have like the skeleton of what you're doing worked out, then actually data can be kind of randomizing, right? Because you have like you can always look at something new and something different, and you can change course kind of with just like the wind. Like whatever happens to the business, you could always do something different. So I do think you need something outside of the data itself that tells you, what is fundamentally meaningful. And then you use the data that you have. And when I say fundamentally meaningful, it's like, again, from the concept of Airbnb, like if you're gonna be a guest or you're gonna be a host, like what are the steps in using the process that, have to happen? And once you have kind of that architecture in place, then you can start to back out of like, the company's mission, which are the steps that we need to work on now. And then once you have that step figured out, then it's like, what data is most relevant to, this problem? And then, again, what hypotheses can we test in service of that problem? So it kind of takes a while to like, fall into, like a pattern or framework like this that really works for the organization. But once you get there, it's super useful.
I'm not sure if it's been a problem for Airbnb, but I guess it's been because you don't show the phone number and stuff like this. So did you had issues with user trying to bypass the platform? And was this something that you find out using data or just by discussing with your users?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's an interesting example of, a problem that you can solve in one of two ways. You can either, use a bunch of data and technology to try to like restrict people from doing something. But I think it's so much better to approach it more from the perspective of incentives. And this is beyond the scope of data, but I think the concept of incentives are that like if people are going off the platform, it's because there's something better for them than the platform, right? And so you should build something that is better for them than going off the platform, which in the case of Airbnb was things like reviews and handling payments and having customer support and and having like a guarantee for hosts that if anything gets broken during the stay, like we'll just cover it. So there were all sorts of policies like this that gave people more of a sense of trust in the experience and actually limited a lot of that sort of behavior.
Hi.
Hi.
I do data for one of the startups here at Side, and one of my biggest concerns is to always be sure that the data. How to ensure the integrity of data, because we have a microservice architecture, and often some developer will change something, and I won't notice till my graphs have flatlined suspiciously for a few days. So do you have any mechanisms or tools that you use to always be sure that your data is good?
Yeah, it's a hard problem, right? I think the best solution is just to have data scientists sitting next to engineers, because I think otherwise you're always chasing engineers down to figure out why they broke your logging. We did, like a year or two ago, start, this long sort of project for completely overhauling the way data is logged, which, forces tests, like unit tests on the data before any code gets pushed that could affect it. So we started to treat our data like any other product, where like you had to be sure that it wasn't broken, before it could go live. It takes a fair amount of infrastructure to get there, and like that's like a big process, but it is obviously a good thing to do. I think before then, there are lots of tests and sort of analyses and dashboards that you can create to make sure things are working. But the best solution is just to kind of have that relationship with engineers, where they know that the changes that they make to logging affect the business as much as pushing a page that's broken. And I think without that, you're always going to be playing catch up.
Okay, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Que la famille.